There could be fluorescent blue chickens. That's possible. Now, either that's piqued your interest sufficiently for you to watch a video about possible worlds, or you've already clicked away. So I'm going to assume that if you're still here, I've got your interest and we can talk a little bit about possible worlds, why we might need them and what they might be. So, I think it's true that it's possible for there to be blue chickens. I actually don't think that there are any of the sort that I'm imagining. Really vivid fluorescent blue chickens. Okay, don't think there are any, but I think they could. And this is an instance of a claim that's true about something that's possible. In the kind of language that might get used in the philosophical literature, it's a modal claim. It's a claim about something that's either possible or necessary. And we make all sorts of these claims all of the time. We say that it's possible that the universe could have been other than it is. We say that it's possible for me to make it home in time tonight to pick up my daughter. We say that a whole bunch of different things are possible and are necessary. Okay, but in virtue of what are those claims true? Come back to the slightly silly example about the fluorescent blue chicken. If it is indeed possible for there to be a fluorescent blue chicken, if that claim is true, what makes it true? Can't be the actual chickens. Can't be the actual chickens because the actual chickens are not in fact fluorescent blue. They look like they're singularly ill-suited to performing the task. Now you might think that there are all of these strange, mysterious and ethereal, not quite real fluorescent blue chickens clucking about the place. Perhaps that's right. Perhaps they're what makes it true that it's possible for there to be fluorescent blue chickens. But nonetheless, that looks like a slightly odd and mysterious answer, right? I mean, if we're saying that these things are somehow less than fully real and wandering around the place, how real are they? What does it mean for something to exist to a degree of reality? Looks like it's creating more mysteriousness than it ought to be. At this point, what we might then do is reach for a philosophical framework of possible worlds. And I'm sure if you've read any contemporary metaphysics, you've come up against this idea of a possible world. And in our theorizing about possible worlds, we're going to want our theories to do a couple of things if we can. The first of those things is to make true our modal claims, to make it true that various things are possible and various things are necessary. And we're also going to want it, as far as possible, to demystify the nature of what it is to be possible. We want to try and understand the notion without committing ourselves to any spooky existence that's mysterious. Okay, at this stage, enter David Lewis, perhaps one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century. And Lewis thought that there really were possible worlds. And a possible world is a complete way that the world could be. So for any possibility you can imagine, there really is a possible world in which that thing is the case. And for Lewis, these worlds are not spooky or strange or mysterious in any way. These are concrete objects, or they contain concrete objects. A world is just taken to be a collection, a maximal collection of spatiotemporally connected objects. So if you're spatiotemporally connected to something, you're in the same world as that. So we're all in the same world as the Big Bang and perhaps the eventual heat death of the universe, as well as objects that are perhaps very distant from us spatially right now. But other possible worlds, not like ours world, other possible worlds are also just like that. They're concrete. They contain concrete objects. They contain concrete objects that are spatiotemporally connected to one another. And we are not ourselves spatiotemporally connected to any of those worlds. Okay. Now this is a huge commitment we've just taken on. For every way that the world could be, there really is a world out there that is that way. And all of these things are concrete collections of objects, spatiotemporally connected to one another. Huge commitment to take on. So this looks like we might want to have good reason for doing it. Indeed, if there are problems, it looks like we might need to give up on them pretty quickly. So notice the two things that the Lewisian view does. The first thing it does is it gives us a ground for all of the claims that we want to say are true about what's possible. If it's possible for there to be fluorescent blue chickens, well, then it is true because there is a world out there that contains them. That's just how we're going to make sense of the modal truths. And notice also this picture is perfectly reductive. A possibility is simply to be identified with a world. A world is a collection of objects that are spatiotemporally related to one another. In that final end of the analysis there, I haven't mentioned anything about possibility and necessity. There's nothing any more spooky in that end analysis than the idea of space, time, and concrete objects. So it looks like Lewis's view is doing pretty well. There are all sorts of technical problems that Lewis's view looks like it might face. But perhaps the position that's given people most pause for thought is the objection that's known as the incredulous stare. And this is a very technical name for the fact that when Lewis proposed this view and he gave lots of talks and describing it, he was most often met with just simply with complete incredulity. People could not understand how he could possibly hold such a view. All of these different worlds are really out there? They're all just like ours? Really? And we're supposed to believe that for some philosophical reasons? That looks like it's a big stretch. And so, although the view is typically taken to be very elegant and to have great virtues, as we've already said, it grounds the truths about what's possible and it gives us a reductive analysis. Nonetheless, people have typically shied away from it. And they've shied away from it into a range of other views that we can perhaps explore here as well. The first of these views is a little bit complicated to try and get your head around, but we need to start here with the idea of a property. Now, a property is just a feature or a characteristic of an object. So my hair has the property of being brown, the camera that I'm speaking to has the property of being black, it has a particular mass, it has a particular density, and so on and so forth. But these are all properties of objects. Now hold that fixed. What we do here is we say, right, what we need to do is to get from those properties to the notion of a possible world. How are we going to do that? We're going to let each property act as its own name in a special world-building language. We're going to build a world, a linguistic ersatz world as it's known, out of these properties which are their own names. And we're going to say that a possible world is just a collection of these properties. Any collection of properties will give you some particular possibility, might be the thought. Okay. And so we can then recapture all sorts of things that we want to say are possible, simply using these properties as their own names and saying there's this collection, that's a possible world, there's that collection, that's another possible world. These are the things that ground the truth of what's possible and what's necessary. Now, one weakness that linguistic ersatzism looks like it might have is perhaps not having the expressive capacity to describe all of the things that we think are possible. Why not? Well, the idea was supposed to be that all of the actually instantiated properties could act as their own name. Okay. But now let's think about something that we do think is possible, and that's that the world could have contained properties that it didn't. How could that have happened? Well, the initial conditions of the universe could have been different. And if the initial conditions of the universe were different, then perhaps different properties would flow from that. Okay, so we think it's possible that there could have been properties that there aren't. And yet we're supposed to build possibilities, we're supposed to build possible worlds out of the properties that there in fact are. That's the only resource we've got available to us. And so it looks then like this idea of these possibilities about properties that don't exist aren't going to be groundable if we build worlds only out of the things that exist in the actual world. Looks like that's going to be too complicated. This is the problem known as the problem of alien properties, properties that aren't in fact instantiated. Now, there are a variety of technical back and forth maneuvers that one can make on this. The possibilities outstrip the actual properties. Looks like it's a fairly compelling one. To some people at any rate. And to those people, there's perhaps a push to move in the direction of another view. It's called propositional ersatzism. So rather than using properties as their own names, we use a different actually existing resource and we build possible worlds out of those instead. And here we use propositions. Now, what's a proposition? Right. With apologies to those of you who have a better grip of the languages than I do, consider three claims that we might want to make, all of which look like they have the same meaning. It's raining, il pleut, and es regnet. Now, those three claims all look like they express the same meaning. They express the same proposition, perhaps. And for our purposes, we're not going to get stuck into the metaphysics of propositions here. That's enough. There is some proposition, there is something, some abstract entity that's expressed by those three sentences in English, French, and German. What we can then do is we can build possible worlds out of these actually existing propositions. So if you want to have it be possible that it's raining, well, you just take the proposition S regnat. And then you put it together with a whole collection of other propositions, and there's your possible world. Likewise, if you want to explore the possibility that there are these fluorescent blue chickens, you simply take the proposition that there is a fluorescent blue chicken, and you bring it into a collection of other propositions, all of which are consistent with it, and there's your possible world. That can then be used to ground the truth of our claims about what's possible. But although the propositional ersatz can do that grounding work, I think it's a little bit less clear that it can do the reductive work. The way that I just described that last case to you was to say that we take the proposition, there could be these fluorescent blue chickens, or there are fluorescent blue chickens, and we combine them with a range of other propositions with which they're consistent. Because after all, we don't want to bring the proposition there are fluorescent blue chickens into a collection with it's not the case that there are fluorescent blue chickens and call that a possible world, because that's not possible. It's not possible that there are and there aren't fluorescent blue chickens, right? That's not possible. So what we have to do then is we have to restrict which propositions get to count as a world. And the way that we typically do that is we say that the collections of propositions must be consistent. And one way of spelling out what consistency is just to say that these propositions can all be true together. It's possible for these propositions to be true together. Of course, then what propositional ersatzism amounts to is the claim that there are a possibility or a possible world is a collection of propositions that it's possible that can be true together. And that's no kind of reduction of this notion of possibility. So perhaps so much the worse for propositional ersatzism, which then brings us on to the final view that we'll consider here. And perhaps it was the one that you intuitively reached for when I started talking about this fanciful idea of fluorescent blue chickens right at the start. This is a position known as combinatorialism. And the combinatorialist wants to say that a state of affairs is possible, or there is a possible world, just in case we can recombine elements of this world to generate that state. So for instance, the reason that it's true that it's possible for there to be blue chickens is that we have the property of fluorescent blueness and we have chickens. And we can combine those things together. And that's what makes it true that we can have fluorescent blue chickens. Now notice again, this has delivered quite an intuitive answer and it looks like it's grounded the truth about what's possible. But it's done so at a particular cost, because we've said that what a world is, what a possible world is simply going to be a matter of it being possible for us to bring together elements of the actual world. These fluorescent blueness and chickens, for instance. And if we were seeking a reduction to try and get away from this accusation, this idea that what's possible is in some sense spooky or strange or opaque to us, then simply inserting possibility back into the analysis of what a world is really looks like it might threaten to undermine that whole project. So, as we've seen, it looks like there's a pressing need to try and say something about what possibility consists in. And contemporary metaphysics makes use of this world discourse, possible world discourse all over the place. It's extraordinarily useful as a device. But exactly what we should think about the nature of those worlds themselves is very much a live topic for discussion. All of the views that we've discussed have particular advantages and disadvantages, and ultimately weighing those is going to be the thing that leads you down one path or another.